Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. You're listening to The Progressive American, and as always, I'm your host, Connor Kelly. Today we are covering the week's news and some controversies that have sprung up around the storm in Texas and the people suffering in it. Without further ado, let's get into the news. In Bessemer, Alabama, 6,000 employees are voting over whether or not to unionize. It could lead to the first union at any Amazon facility in the United States. It is worth pointing out again and again that of the 100 or more Amazon facilities, none of them have a union of any kind. Amazon is perfectly aware of the possibility of a larger workers' uprising exploding as a result of this movement, and they have tried to delay the vote on whether to unionize or not. The Chicago Tribune and the Associated Press reports that attempts by Amazon to limit the vote to in-person voting only have failed. As of Friday, the voting has begun, and historically attempts to unionize within Amazon have failed. But with the pandemic in full swing and the conditions of Amazon's warehouses under increased scrutiny, it is possible that Bessemer could become the first Amazon location to officially unionize. Considering how closely monitored Amazon's workers' times is, and how brutal the work can be at Amazon stations, it is high time a union is formed. Amazon may pay well in terms of base pay, but without conditions that match the value of said pay, it shouldn't act surprised that there are more calls to unionize. A $15 an hour wage is not worth being unable to use the bathroom in peace, as some Amazon workers have alleged. It is far beyond reason to demand that workers refuse to advocate for themselves, especially with a multi-billion-dollar company like Amazon consistently lauding itself over communities. While I would not be too optimistic, the fact that COVID-19 has put the squeeze on many of these businesses puts union workers in a good position to advocate for greater rights in the workplace, and I hope, as time goes on, Bessemer union advocates will be able to succeed here and provoke a larger movement. In other news, the minimum wage has become a source of contention between progressives and moderate Democrats. The Biden administration came to power through an ascendant progressive wing and the American public's opposition to Donald Trump. But more than that, it was the result of a desire for change. For many, they voted for a change in economic policy. Indeed, in 2019, a poll conducted by Pew Research Center found that an estimated 67% of Americans supported raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour. Florida recently voted to increase its minimum wage to $15 an hour as well, but with a narrow majority in the Senate, the Biden administration has signaled that it would be inclined to a raise of $12 an hour or $13 an hour as opposed to the proposed $15 in a town hall on Tuesday saying, quote, "Let's say you said you're going to increase the minimum wage from $7.25 an hour between now and the year 2025 to $12 an hour to $13 an hour. You double someone's pay, and the impact on business would be absolutely de minimis, and it would grow the GDP." End quote. This seemingly sudden shift in position is sure to outrage many a progressive, something I can sympathize with. But with it being unclear whether or not the minimum wage will be within the scope of the budget reconciliation process, and Republicans inclined to oppose any shift in the minimum wage, it will be difficult to push through any change on that front, especially after one study came out suggesting that 1.4 million Americans would be unemployed, but poverty rates would be decreased. This complicated picture shows that Biden's position with progressives is far from guaranteed, and even then, with moderate Democrats like Joe Manchin calling for $11 as the set minimum wage, as reported by the San Francisco Chronicle, it is clear that the Biden administration will not necessarily be ready to pass a $15 minimum wage. If there is a rise in the minimum wage, which itself is far from guaranteed either, chances are it will be far more restrained than progressives would want. Personally, I would like to see a $15 an hour minimum wage, but with a moderate Biden administration and an even more obstructionist Republican caucus ready to meet him on any rise in the minimum wage, it is unlikely that will occur. That said, if he really wanted to, Biden could get Vice President Harris to overturn the Senate parliamentarian and make the minimum wage a budget reconciliation issue. But as it stands right now, that is unlikely. Still, I'm not going to ask my fellow progressives to stand down or back down in any way, shape, or form. Far from it. If we get $11 or $13, progressives need to keep pushing. But in our pushing for a greater wage, we need to also change the system that creates Biden's hesitance in the first place. But so long as we ignore the institutions that create such unwillingness to act, we will be back where we started, waiting for an opportunity to create a better future for America. We will be right back, and I hope you'll stay with us. Welcome back to the Progressive American. Thank you for staying with us. Unfortunately, I have to turn to some more depressing and somewhat angry news. This week, the Washington Post came out with an expose on Alden Global Capital and its role in destroying modern media, particularly local media. This is something that will likely go under the rug, but with the media changing every day, I think it is extremely important to talk about how one company has hampered local news specifically. In normal discourse surrounding the media, many Americans will talk about things such as liberal or conservative media, myself included. But the reality is far more complicated. Alden Global Capital, which was founded by Randall Smith, is perhaps one of the most dangerous aspects of modern media, private equity. Alden, by extension of its massive buyouts, has purchased numerous newspapers over the years, including the Boston Herald and the Denver Post, making massive cuts to their staff and infrastructure, bleeding them dry for profits. In fact, I believe it was the subject of a John Oliver bit. With the cuts to their organization, these newspapers began to fail to provide more and more news, effectively making them shells of their former selves. Alden is a master at this. In fact, Alden currently has 32% of the shares at the Chicago Tribune and could buy it in the near future. All of this culminates at a time when local newspapers are in decline, when profits are low, and subscriptions are the main source of revenue, something that newspapers, particularly local newspapers, are unable to get access to without serious effort. When Alden comes to town, buys up a local newspaper, and racks up debt because it keeps making cuts to the main source of revenue, the newspaper remains responsible for all of that debt under current law, effectively ensuring their collapse. And Smith, Alden's founder, benefits from that. To put that into perspective, Randall Smith has been accumulating mansions in Palm Beach, Florida, starting at around 7 mansions for him and his wife, while major companies that he has bought have been doing massive amounts of layoffs, cuts, and other things that really have bled dry local media. If you want to know what's going on with your local city councilor, you would need to know from a local newspaper. But if that newspaper was owned by Alden, you could be guaranteed that that newspaper would not have the resources to provide adequate information to you. But more than just mansions, without local newspapers checking in on people like him, Randall Smith is practically a ghost. I tried finding a picture of him, but only one is a direct photo of him, and it came from a protest site. To put this another way, he's destroying the very news organizations that should be finding dirt on him. I don't know what's going to happen to modern news if this continues, but what I do know is that private equity in its current form and relationship with local news is entirely unacceptable to the democratic process. The law has to be changed to ensure that men like Randall Smith can't gut the discourse for his benefit and the benefit of his rich friends. When you're learning about your local community, you don't go to a national newspaper. You go to local news. You're dependent upon them. When you want to know whether or not your broken pipe will be reimbursed by the city for emergency costs, you don't go to the New York Times or the Washington Post. You go to whatever local newspaper was sitting in on those council meetings 3 weeks ago that you didn't bother to look at. Because at the end of the day, those local newspapers are entirely dedicated to informing local citizens. If Alden gets their way, there won't be any newspapers like that left to stand and inform you. You'll just be waiting on the government to explain what's going to happen to you without any knowledge about why it's happening or if it's going to be a straight up existence of just listening to authority. In another display of the shift in media, the face of radio conservatism has passed away. Rush Limbaugh, the controversial and frankly hostile radio host, died on Wednesday after a bout with lung cancer. Many a so-called dittohead, the name that was associated with Limbaugh listeners, would listen to his show and listen to the rants and ravings of his heart and mind. While his show was far from what it once was, losing Limbaugh will not be an easy thing for right-wing media to recover from. I want to make something clear about Rush, and I have to be careful about what I'm doing here since he's passed, meaning he can't defend himself here, but the fact that I have to bring up is that the mere act of passing does not mean that he is beyond criticism, nor does it mean his role in creating a noxious body politic is beyond reproach. This is the same man who would practice and promote racialized songs on his show about Obama, the first black president of the United States, all of which were intended to mock his skin color. I'm not going to suggest that I am in any way, shape, or form happy that he died, because I'm not. No person should be celebrating another person's death. I understand why some have, but the fact is that I will not be doing that. You can do whatever you like, but it's a matter of my personal dignity here. What matters to me is that the truth about Rush Limbaugh and his behavior and his role in the body politic remain at the forefront of the discussion surrounding his death. Rush Limbaugh was not a man of conscience. He was a man of opportunity. Rush Limbaugh consistently played to the darker nature of the American political system and the American electorate. When people were dying in the 1980s involved in AIDS, basically they were dying of AIDS, I won't get into the details, Rush would consistently mock them for it. This is the same guy who now, many a conservative are defending, saying that we shouldn't celebrate his death. And again, we shouldn't. But pretending as though Rush Limbaugh was some sort of virtuous saint and that he is deserving of immense respect and total ceremonial honors ignores who he was. Rush Limbaugh was an opportunist, and calling him a bigot for the context of his statements and the full breadth of his statements is not disrespectful to the dead. It's just an accurate representation of history. So there's going to be people out there saying things like, you shouldn't be disrespectful to him. And I'm not. You just say, simply put, when you're talking about Rush Limbaugh and all the things he said, you say, I'm not being disrespectful to Rush Limbaugh. I'm describing him as exactly as he would want me to, because he would probably revel in my criticisms as if they were sign of his virtue. And that's all I have to say about Rush Limbaugh. In more urgent and less personal news, the state of Texas has found that the cold has been disastrous to its state. For several days, at least 500,000 people were without power, but with updates coming in, it appears power is returning. Still, infrastructure is far from ready and controversy is already brewing. St. David's South Austin Medical Center and other medical centers in Austin area are running low on water due to the loss of water pressure, and they are now dealing with more and more patients due to the conditions being created by the cold. This means that they are now dealing with more and more patients, meaning that hospitals are providing help to people while also being desperate for help themselves. Even as power returns, many Texans are faced with the lack of quality drinking water, and at least 50 people have died as a result of the electronic failures that has created this Texas situation. Meanwhile, Senator Ted Cruz made an ill-advised and frankly obscene trip to Cancun while his constituents were freezing to death. Some may argue that Cruz has no official authority over Texas and therefore has no responsibility to act on this. And while part of that is true, as a senator, Cruz possesses immense political capital that he can use to put pressure on Republican officials to fix the problems that are facing his people. He may not be able to legislate, but he absolutely can put pressure where it is necessary to help his constituents. And what is evident with the current emergency response and the emergencies that we are now facing in Texas and the necessary federal regulations and action in the state is that Texas has made a massive mistake. It had its own electrical grid in order to avoid federal regulations and restrictions on how the grid would be constructed. But in doing so, they lessened the quality of the product they were dealing with. As the Washington Post reports, Texas officials routinely neglected the infrastructure of this electrical grid, ensuring that it wasn't prepared just to maintain itself, but also it was ill-prepared to handle the cold, which has left 50 people dead and the state of Texas in need of FEMA intervention by Joseph R. Biden, the President of the United States. I don't know what's going to happen to Texas, but I do know this. If Texas is going to continue to deal with these kinds of things, then the people of Texas need to demand more from their leaders. And I don't care what party they're a part of if they've neglected their people like this. Nobody should have to deal with this. I mean nobody. Nobody in their right mind should have to worry about whether or not their water pressure is going to blow to the point where they can't even get water at a hospital because they got too cold and need hypothermia treatment or any other sort of medical treatment. Whenever you think of the electoral decisions of the state of Texas, just remember that Texas is still an American state. It is still entitled to the dignity that we all enjoy every day of our lives. So let's not pretend like we can engage in partisan hackery going after Texas and its people. We should be going after leadership, yes, pointing out their failures, but let's not go after the people because right now they're boiling snow to determine whether or not they'll be able to have drinking water tomorrow, and that is unacceptable.